Grief doesn't really follow a timeline. It shows up unexpectedly, and sometimes loud and overwhelming. Other times, quiet and heavy. But one thing is certain, you don't have to navigate it alone. And in today's episode, we're talking about grief. Not in a clinical step-by-step way, but as something real, human, and deeply personal. Whether your heart is breaking right now or you're supporting someone else through loss, this episode is here to hold space for you. Hey there, and welcome back to Mindful Chatting. I'm so glad you're here today. Even though this topic we're diving into is one that many of us wish we could avoid, grief and loss, they're part of that human experience, but they can leave us feeling isolated, confused, and untethered. Today, I want to explore what grief really looks like. Not just the textbook version, but the raw, emotional reality of navigating life after loss. We'll talk about the stages of grief, why healing isn't linear, and I'll share some tools, apps, book recommendations, and gentle exercises that can help you cope. Whether you're mourning a loved one or a relationship, a version of your life that no longer exists, or even something intangible like identity or health, this conversation is for you. So grab your comfort drink, find a cozy spot, and let's walk through this together. So I think diving into it, I think understanding the grieving process, you have to understand the stages that you go through when you're grieving. And there really is no right way to grieve, and everybody's journey is really unique. However, understanding common grief responses can actually provide you a framework for navigating this experience for yourself. And I don't think a lot of people know about the 5 stages of grief. This comes from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model. And they have developed and expanded this into 7 stages, but there's these core 5 stages that I really want to make sure that we understand. So the first stage is denial. And initially, many people kind of struggle to accept the reality of whatever this loss is. And this is really kind of a defense mechanism. It kind of helps cushion this emotional impact, and it helps provide time to kind of gradually process the shock of this loss or this change or this thing that we actually have to move towards acceptance with. Denial can look like a bunch of different ways. Denial could be like, nope, this isn't happening. Or avoidance. Like, I know I have to do this particular thing, but I'm going to act like it's not there. Or I'm just going to find myself in other busy situations and I don't have, quote, time to deal with whatever it is that this new change, this loss that I have to deal with. So it can be very overt or very covert depending on the person and how they're kind of struggling with this grief. Bargaining is the second one, and this looks really different for everybody, but individuals can kind of attempt to make deals with more of like a higher power, or even if this is more of a loss of like a change of what's happening, kind of trying to negotiate whether or not we can try to change or shift this loss or this change to happen. And sometimes you can see people replay like if only scenarios in their minds to kind of hope to change the outcome. So this is a person that will say like, well, if only I had shown up sooner, then maybe this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. Or if only I had make this one decision, then maybe I can change the outcome of that. But again, all of these kind of stages keep us stuck, because if I feel that I have the power, which is what I really feel in this grief, in this loss, is that I have no power. I feel very helpless because I have to endure this loss or this change. If I can think about ways to negotiate or bargain, or if I could change the outcome, again, I'm centering my energy and my focus on something that I have this falsehood of control, and I don't actually have to address and put energy and time to whatever it is that I have to accept when it comes to that loss or that change that I have to deal with. The next stage is anger. And as you kind of have this reality that sets in that this loss or this change is actually happening, anger often kind of emerges towards oneself and others, and it even into the person that has been lost. And this is a kind of this normal part of emotional processing. Anger can look like a bunch of different things. And I think if we don't have a place to point blame or to put our focus to, the anger will eventually turn into ourselves, and it will look like this self-punishment. Anger is kind of sticky because if we do have somewhere where we can point a finger or place blame, all of our energy and focus allows us to point to that particular person or that thing that really caused the loss or the change to happen. But what that also does is it delays our grieving, because if we're focusing our energy and our time on this thing that's stopping us from this loss or change occurring, then we don't have to actually endure it. Because here I am, I can point it, you're the problem, you're the fault, but really all that does is steer my energy away from the fact that I actually have to deal with this loss and this change that's happening to me. Next stage is depression. And depression is when we actually feel the full weight of this loss or this change that is happening to us. And this can kind of bring a deep sadness, loneliness, or even a sense of despair. We kind of get lost in this depression. We don't know how to function or how to move forward. And really that's what this depression does, is it keeps us from going or moving forward, but it keeps us in this state of like, I'm sad. I don't want to have to accept to move forward of what's going on. And this is where you might see a lot of fear and like, I don't know what life is going to look like if I were to accept or move forward with what's going on. And that change and that awareness is really scary for me. And so that fear drives us into sadness and depression. But a part of depression is acknowledging these emotions as kind of this really crucial step. So depression can be a place where we can kind of stick and stay for a while. But if we have the ability to process what's going on within this moment and how we feel about it, and we have people that we can talk to or we can go to therapy, depression actually acknowledges a lot of emotions that were kind of hidden underneath that moves us towards this last stage. And that's acceptance. Acceptance does not mean, though, that we are actually over whatever it is that happened. But really what acceptance is that we're coming to terms with the fact that this is the reality. And I always tell people about acceptance is you never have to like or be okay with loss or this change. And I think there's this myth when we come to acceptance of that we have to embrace it and we have to like where it is now. And that's not true. We just have to accept that it is what it is. We nor have to like it or hate it. It just is. And that's what brings us to this term of like, this is my reality now. I have to accept that this loss and change has happened to me, but I never have to be okay or I have to like what's happened to me. And also within this acceptance stage, you're learning to kind of integrate what this loss looks like into your life and kind of finding ways and learning and observing what life is going to be like as you move forward. One of the things I really want to talk about these stages is even though they look linear, they're not. People can bounce around in all these different stages at different times, even throughout the day, depending on how fresh and raw this loss is. So it's important to note that even though we may move back and forth, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're regressing. So one day we can be very accepting of the reality and we understand and we've come to terms with it. And then the next moment we can be angry about it. But that doesn't mean that we've regressed in our grief process. If anything, that is the process. There was something that was probably triggered or brought up that made you think about our loss and our change in a different way, which caused you to go through an anger process. And so a lot of going through grief is allowing yourself to go through these stages and to accept that these stages are a part of my grieving and to not rush through them or try to jump over them. I know we always try to avoid going over the depression stage, but as you can kind of see, the depression stage actually helps us get closer to acceptance. So we need this depression stage, even though it's really, really hard to get through it. But also we don't want to rush through them. We want to give them their time and their grace and give ourselves permission to sit with it as we're going through this loss and change in our life. Okay, and I always want to make sure that everyone walks away with some kind of tool, some kind of recommendation, something that they can walk away with each episode that they can start doing now for whatever the topic is. So I'm going to start going into tools and strategies for how to cope with grief if you're going through it right now, or you know somebody who's going through grief right now. So the first thing I want to talk about is being able to express your emotions. So this is about going through each of these stages and being able to give yourself permission for whatever emotion comes up within these first stages. This is where journaling within the grief process is so beneficial for people. Because if you journal about your thoughts and your feelings, it can actually help process your grief and help it move through it a little bit like smoother than someone who's just kind of looping and staying stuck in their head in their grief. Journaling can allow you to express it and an outlet, even if you may not have somebody around you that you can necessarily talk to. It gives you a space to kind of identify, what is it that I'm actually feeling? Why do I feel this way? How do I express this emotion? And what can I do to cope with it? Creative outlets are also really good, like art and music and poetry. A lot of these things are made within the emotional human experience, and grief is not, an exception to any of these things. So going to creative outlets like music or art or poetry to kind of give words and meanings to things that are maybe really hard to articulate for you right now. And that can also provide an emotional release, because if we have something that really displays what it is that we're going through, it can feel very cathartic, it can feel less isolating, and it can feel like I'm not the only one that's going through this or has gone through this. Also, speaking to people, talking to people openly about this support or this emotion or the thing that you're going through. Using your emotional support system to kind of help you through this. If you don't have anybody to help you try therapy. Therapy is a great way to learn how to identify and express your emotions and learn how to cope and process what you're going through. This kind of leads me into my next strategy, which is seeking professional help. There are particular therapists that are called grief therapists or grief counselors that focus just on grief. And they can provide more tailored guidance and coping strategies that maybe a typical therapist who doesn't specialize in grief might be able to offer you. Grief counselors do specialize in this, so they're going to provide you that space and give you that time and process and that healing that wouldn't be rushed, but actually giving you permission to kind of sit with this because they're so specialized within this particular field. Cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, also acceptance commitment therapy or ACT, can also help you reframe some thoughts and emotions surrounding your grief. So even if you can't necessarily find a specialist within the grief realm, you can find a therapist that can specialize in these particular modalities that may be able to help process your grief. This might be a raw one, especially with how close the loss or the change has happened to you, but kind of establishing some kind of ritual or honoring of this person or this loss that you have is always a good place to start, because we want to create some kind of memory and some honor around what happened. So you can hold, a memorial or create a memory book. This can also kind of offer some kind of sense of closure, but this ability to give yourself permission to come back to these things when you are struggling within a particular stage of your grief. And by going through these particular things and giving them a space to identify what's going on can also help with emotional expression as well. Some people will plant a tree, write letters, lighting a candle and like remembrance. These all are very meaningful rituals to people. And I always tell people to be super creative, and especially if it's a loss to a person, make your ritual and your meaningful experience tailored to that particular person. So like, for example, I had a client who lost a very close person and they were all about cooking food. And so I said, well, why don't we get all of their recipes together? So it's not necessarily about getting a memorable book of all pictures of them, but maybe getting a book of all their different types of recipes, and then maybe on the day of remembrance, you are cooking their recipes as if they were with you. And that could be more of a remembrance of like what's going on than maybe a picture book could possibly do, or a memorial that could possibly do. So making it very tailored to whatever it is for that person can also bring that sense of closeness when you're experiencing or remembering them. The biggest thing that goes to the wayside when we have any kind of big loss or change in our life is us. And we don't practice and prioritize enough self-care or taking care of ourselves during points of our grief. And we need to start prioritizing sleep, our nutrition, our physical activity. We need to engage, in mindfulness and relaxation techniques such as meditation or yoga. Our most recent episode was on mindfulness and meditation. If you want to go back and want to talk about the different types of meditation, that would be a good place to start. You can also set small and achievable goals to kind of restore a sense of normalcy and purpose for yourself. Because I feel like if we don't fall back on our routines and our self-care, everything can kind of feel very mundane and we don't know where to go or where to start. And so falling back on taking a shower every day, brushing our teeth, or getting dressed, those are very simple things that we tend to kind of neglect when we're going through a lot of despair or depression, especially within the depression stage of grief. And so coming back to those as kind of our stable foundation can also help you express and process grief a lot more. Joining a support group can actually be really helpful. And it sounds kind of cliche, but knowing that you're not the only one going through some kind of grief and loss can feel very soothing and cathartic for people, because going through a grief or a loss or a big change or transition can feel very isolating, especially if it's moving you into territory you've never been before. And so knowing that other people have been through it, or that other people are experiencing with it, can feel a little less isolating for you. There are a lot of local grief support groups and online communities that can offer you this kind of sense of connection as you're going through stuff. And by engaging with others who have experienced like those similar losses can provide some comfort and, that kind of shared understanding that you're not the only one going through it. I do want to talk about some books that I recommend on grief and healing. There's one called Option B by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant, and this is kind of a guide to finding a resilience after some loss that you've had. There's also the Grief Recovery Handbook by John James and Russell Friedman, and this is a good step-by-step process for moving beyond your loss. There's also It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine, and that's a compassionate exploration of like grief and healing. And there's also Bearing the Unbearable by Joanne, I'm going to totally butcher her name, but Cassator. And it's a deeply moving book that can be transformative on that power of grief. And I'll put a link in the show notes for all of these book recommendations if you're wanting a little bit more reading into this. There is a really good grief app called Grief Works, and this provides a guided session from grief specialists that you can use within the app that I think would be really helpful. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes for this app if you'd like to try it. I also want to walk away with a couple exercises to kind of help support the healing process that would be really helpful and beneficial for people if you are going through a grief or a loss right now. So again, mindfulness and grounding techniques. I have a handout on our website through Mindful Resources. We have a grounding and vagus nerve exercise handout that you can look into that gives you a bunch of different grounding and vagus nerve exercises to help relax you. If you're looking for one right now, there's the 5 senses exercises where you identify, things that you can see, hear, touch, smell, and taste to kind of anchor yourself into the present moment. You can also do what they call a body scan meditation. And again, if you want more information about meditation and mindfulness, our past episode went way more deep into this. But a body scan meditation helps kind of release that stored tension and emotions within your body. You can also do letter writing. So letter writing can be writing a letter to that person or even that thing or that situation that changed within your life, and expressing emotions and memories and kind of those unfinished thoughts that we tend to loop on in our head. Writing a letter to that change or that person or that thing that we lost can be very cathartic and helpful, of being able to say the things that we wish we could have said or we wish we could have done. This is a really good exercise to expand on those what if scenarios too, if you're in that bargaining stage. So the letter writing is a really good exercise. Also, you can do visualization, so you can imagine placing your grief inside of a box and then allowing yourself to open it when you're ready. This is called a container exercise, where you imagine what the container would look like, and then you kind of dump everything into the container when it comes to that grief, that loss, that change that you're working on. And this kind of acknowledges the grief as a process and not necessarily as an end point. That container's always with you. One of the things I like to tell people about grief is that I don't personally feel that grief ever really ends. I think grief just changes over time, because if we were to say that our grief is over, then that particular scenario, that thing, is over, and bringing it up would mean that we no longer think or feel anything about it. And when we're talking about a loss of a person in particular, even though we might necessarily think about that loss or that person every day, bringing it up always has some kind of emotional attachment attached to this person, and that's healthy. And so to say that I would want to get rid of that, I think that would be very detaching for that person. So I always try to tell people that grief just changes as we grow and as we develop a life without this particular thing that we're missing. So if you stuck with me on this episode, I'm so glad you're still here. I think grief changes us. It reshapes our world and really challenges the way we connect to ourselves and others. But in that pain, there's also room for compassion, reflection, and, eventually growth. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It really means learning how to live again while honoring what or who we've lost. If this episode resonated with you, I encourage you to take your time, be gentle with yourself, and use some of the tools we talked about today. I'll include the links and the resources and books and apps in the show notes so you can explore them at your own pace. And if you're looking for more support or just want to feel a little less alone in your grief, you're always welcome here. Until next time, take care of your heart and know that healing is possible, even if it looks different for everyone. This podcast may contain affiliate links, and if you click on these links and make a purchase, I may receive a small commission at no extra cost to you. I only recommend products and services that I personally use and believe will add value to you. Thank you for supporting the podcast.